This happened when I was very young, so some of the details are fuzzy, but the fear has never faded. At the time, it was just my mom and me. She was a single mother, worked long hours, and did her best to be both parents at once. Because of that, I was used to being alone with her, especially at night. We lived in a small house, nothing special, quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where nothing bad was ever supposed to happen. My bedroom was at the end of the hallway, across from the bathroom. Almost every night, without fail, my mom would check on me when she got up to use the bathroom. I remember that clearly. I'd usually pretend to be asleep, but I'd feel her presence. The door opening slightly, the soft creak of the floor. Sometimes she'd pull the blanket up over my shoulders or brush my hair away from my face. That routine made me feel safe, which is why what happened that night still doesn't make sense to me. I woke up suddenly, the way kids sometimes do, with no obvious reason. The room was dark except for a faint glow from the hallway night light slipping in under the door. I remember feeling uneasy right away, like something had pulled me out of sleep before I was ready. I thought I heard sound. It came from my closet. It wasn't loud, just a soft noise like fabric shifting or something brushing against cardboard boxes. The kind of sound you could easily mistake for nothing at all. I turned my head toward the foot of my bed. My mom was standing there. She was silhouetted in the darkness, but I could tell it was her. Same height, same posture. She lifted her hand and gave me a small, playful wave, the kind she always did when she caught me awake late at night. I immediately relaxed. "Go back to sleep," she said softly. Her voice sounded normal, calm, familiar. Then she turned and walked toward my closet. I watched as she opened the door and stepped inside. Instead of closing it fully, she pulled it almost shut, leaving just a narrow crack. Then she leaned forward slightly and just stood there. Her face was mostly hidden, but I could see one of her eyes through the crack in the door. It was watching me. I didn't feel scared at first. If anything, I felt confused. I remember thinking she was being silly, maybe trying to make me laugh. Then something about it started to feel wrong. She didn't blink. She didn't move. She just kept staring at me through that thin crack. Her eye perfectly centered in the darkness. I called out to her. She didn't respond. I laughed nervously, like a kid does when they don't know what else to do. I pulled the blanket up closer to my face, still watching that eye in the closet. Eventually, exhaustion took over. I fell asleep with that image burned into my mind. The next morning, everything felt normal. Sunlight filled the kitchen. I sat at the table eating cereal while my mom moved around getting ready for work. I remember glancing at her and feeling strange, like I was looking at someone I'd just seen in a dream. So I asked her, "Why were you hiding in my closet last night?" She stopped moving. Slowly, she turned and looked at me. Her expression wasn't amused or confused in a casual way. It was concerned, deeply concerned. "What are you talking about?" she asked. I explained what I'd seen. Her standing at the foot of my bed, telling me to go back to sleep, going into my closet and watching me through the door. She didn't laugh. She didn't brush it off. She sat down across from me and asked me to repeat everything, slowly. When I finished, she shook her head. "I wasn't in your room at all last night," she said. "I slept straight through." At first, she assumed someone had broken into the house. She checked every door, every window, the locks. Nothing was disturbed. Nothing was missing. There were no signs of anyone being there. Then she suggested maybe it had been a dream, a very vivid dream. I want to believe that. But there was one problem. I knew the difference between dreams and reality, even at that age. And I remembered waking up in the same position I'd fallen asleep in. I remembered the room exactly as it was. I remembered the way the hallway light cast shadows on the wall. And most of all, I remembered how awake I felt. For a long time, I tried to forget about it. But over the years, things happened that made it harder to dismiss. I started noticing small gaps in my memory, moments where I'd swear someone had spoken to me, only to find out later they hadn't. I'd see figures in my peripheral vision that vanished the moment I turned my head. Doctors eventually called them hallucinations. I've had 2 others since then. Neither of them came close to how real that night felt. As I got older, I started questioning details. Why did it look exactly like my mom? Why did it know her habits, her voice, her routine? And why the closet? Years later, while cleaning out my childhood room before moving, I found something that brought everything rushing back. Scratches. Deep scratches on the inside of the closet door. They were old, faint, painted over so many times they were barely visible unless the light hit them just right. Long, uneven lines clustered around the height where a face would be. I asked my mom about them. She said they'd always been there. She assumed they were from a previous owner, or from me, as a kid, messing around with toys. But no, I didn't make them, and I know no one else should have been inside that closet. To this day, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, convinced someone is standing at the foot of my bed. I don't open my eyes right away. I wait. I listen. And no matter how old I get, no matter where I live, I still refuse to sleep with the closet door even slightly open. Because the most terrifying part isn't that I might have hallucinated my mother. It's the thought that maybe something else knew exactly how to pretend to be her. This happened in 2009 when I was still a teenager. My parents were in the middle of renovating a house we had just bought, and because of the noise, dust, and chaos, they decided it would be easier if I spent the weekend at my uncle's ranch. He lived a few hours away, out in the countryside, surrounded by open fields and patches of forest. I never felt particularly comfortable around my uncle. He wasn't abusive or cruel, just distant. Quiet in a way that felt heavy. The kind of person who could sit in a room with you for hours without saying more than a few words. We weren't close, and staying alone in his house made me uneasy, but I didn't have much choice. It was my second night there. That Saturday happened to coincide with one of the worst thunderstorms I've ever experienced. I'm not exaggerating when I say there were lightning strikes every few seconds. The thunder followed almost immediately, loud enough to rattle the windows and make the walls vibrate. We were right in the center of it. I actually liked storms back then. Something about lying in bed and listening to the rain made it easier for me to fall asleep. That night, I stayed up later than usual watching TV, letting the storm provide background noise. When the movie ended, I turned off the television and lay there, staring at the ceiling as flashes of lightning lit up the room in brief bursts of white light. That's when I heard it, a metallic thud. It happened at the exact same moment a bolt of lightning struck nearby. At first, I brushed it off. The storm was intense. Things get knocked around during storms. Branches, loose metal, old structures shifting under pressure. About 20 seconds later, it happened again. Another lightning strike. Another metallic thud. This one sounded closer. Not loud, but sharp. Deliberate. I sat up slightly in bed, listening. The house went quiet except for the rain and distant thunder. Then another flash of lightning, and once again, the same sound. I remember thinking how perfectly timed it was. Too perfectly timed. Still, I didn't want to jump to conclusions. My uncle's ranch had old sheds, gates, and equipment scattered around the property. Something could have been getting hit by debris or blown around by the wind. But my stomach had already started to tighten. I considered waking my uncle, but the thought made me hesitate. He didn't like being disturbed, and I didn't want to look stupid over nothing. So I waited. When the sound came a fourth time, I knew something wasn't right. I got out of bed and walked to the guest bedroom window. Rain was pouring down the glass, so hard it distorted everything outside, turning the fields into a blurry black void. A lightning flash illuminated the property for a split second. I didn't see anything, but once again, the metallic hit came immediately afterward. This time, it sounded like it was coming from just to the left of the window, close enough that I realized it was somewhere near the house. I stood there, heart racing, listening as the storm continued to rage. Another flash. Another hit. At that point, fear took over. I decided to do something I knew my uncle wouldn't approve of. I was going to open the window and look outside. I unlatched it and slid it up just enough to stick my head out. Instantly, rain and wind blasted into the room, soaking my shirt and face. I leaned out and looked to the left. Lightning struck again, and for a fraction of a second, the entire property lit up like daylight. I saw a person. They were dressed entirely in black, crouched low near the outside basement door. One arm was raised in the air, and in that brief flash of light, I saw what was in their hand. A heavy metal object. Before the sky went dark again, I saw them bring it down against the basement door lock. That was the sound. They weren't sheltering from a storm. They were trying to break in. I pulled my head back inside and slammed the window shut, locking it as quietly as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I felt dizzy. I stood frozen, listening. Lightning crashed again, but this time there was no metallic thud. That terrified me more than anything else, because it meant they had stopped. I ran back to my bed and lay down, turning my body away from the window. I forced myself to stay still, barely breathing, pretending to be asleep. My mind raced with awful possibilities. Had they heard me open the window? Had they seen my face during the lightning flash? Were they moving closer? Another lightning strike. No sound. Another. Still nothing. Minutes passed. Then more lightning. Still no metal hits. I began to hope that whoever it was had given up and left. After several more strikes without the noise, I worked up the courage to get out of bed and go wake my uncle. I turned toward the window and screamed. There was a figure standing directly outside the glass, staring in at me. They were so close that their outline was unmistakable. Their face was mostly shadowed, but I could see the shape of their head and shoulders, motionless in the storm. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted out of the room and down the hallway, screaming for my uncle. He burst out of his bedroom in nothing but his pajamas, holding a hunting rifle. Without asking questions, he ran outside into the storm, barefoot, shouting and scanning the property. I stayed inside, shaking. After several minutes, he came back in, soaked and furious. He didn't find anyone. The storm eventually passed, but neither of us slept the rest of the night. The next morning, when daylight revealed the property, we went to the basement door. The lock was badly damaged, bent, cracked, almost broken. My uncle examined it closely and told me that 3 or 4 more solid hits would have been enough to force it open. He put a hand on my shoulder and told me I'd done the right thing by paying attention. That day, my parents came to get me. I never spent another night at that ranch. As far as I know, my uncle never had another incident like that. Or if he did, he never told us. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd gone to sleep earlier that night. If I hadn't stayed up to watch that movie. If I hadn't been awake to hear those sounds. And I can't shake the feeling that whoever was out there wasn't just trying to steal something. They waited for the storm. They used the lightning to cover the noise. They stopped the moment they realized someone was awake. Which means if I hadn't been, they might have gotten inside. This happened when I was in my early 20s, during a period of my life when I was living alone for the first time. I had just moved into a small rental house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't isolated in the countryside, but it wasn't exactly busy either. A few houses on my street, a narrow road, and a tree line at the end that led into a large, undeveloped lot. The house itself was old, but well kept. One floor, creaky hardwood, thin walls. The kind of place where you could hear every sound at night, once everything else went quiet. At first, I loved it. I worked late shifts, so most nights I didn't get home until after midnight. I'd make something quick to eat, watch TV, then go to bed around 2 or 3 in the morning. The neighborhood was always silent by then, which made it easier to unwind. That silence is what made me notice him. The first time, it was subtle enough that I almost ignored it. I had just shut off the TV and turned off the living room lights when I noticed a shape outside the front window. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the streetlight, maybe a shadow from a tree branch moving in the wind. But when I looked closer, I realized it was a person. A man was standing on the sidewalk directly across from my house. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. I remember feeling mildly uneasy, but not scared. People do weird things sometimes. Maybe he was waiting for someone. Maybe he was on his phone. Still, I watched him for a full minute. He didn't move. Eventually, I brushed it off, locked the door, and went to bed. The next night, I saw him again. Same spot, same posture, standing on the sidewalk across from my house, facing it. This time, I stood in the dark living room and watched longer. At least 5 minutes. He didn't pull out a phone. He didn't smoke. He didn't pace. He just stood there. I tried to get a better look at him, but the streetlight behind him made his face hard to see. He looked average in height and build, wearing dark clothes that blended into the night. After a while, he turned and walked away down the street, disappearing past the trees. That's when my unease turned into something heavier. By the third night, I was already dreading looking out the window. Sure enough, he was there again. Same place, same position. This time, I noticed something different. He was closer. Not by much, maybe a few feet, but enough that I was sure I wasn't imagining it. He was no longer standing directly under the streetlight. He was just outside its brightest glow. I stayed hidden in the dark, watching him. My heart started to race when I realized he was facing my front door. Not the window, the door. I told myself I was overreacting. I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and went to bed, leaving the hallway light on. That night, I barely slept. The next morning, I told myself I wouldn't look for him again. I tried to convince myself it was coincidence. Maybe he lived nearby. Maybe he was waiting for rides or walking at night. That illusion didn't last long. On the fourth night, I got home later than usual. It was almost 3 a.m. As I pulled into my driveway, my headlights swept across the front of my house. And there he was, standing at the end of my driveway. This time, he wasn't across the street. He was on my property. He didn't react when my headlights hit him. He didn't flinch or turn away. He just stood there, facing the house, like he had been frozen in place. I stayed in my car, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart pounding so hard I could hear it. For a moment, we just existed there together. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked directly at me. I can't properly describe the feeling that hit me in that moment. It wasn't panic, it was something colder. A certainty that this wasn't random anymore. I honked the horn. He didn't react. I honked again, longer this time. Nothing. Finally, I turned the car off, grabbed my phone, and called my brother. I didn't even know what I was going to say. I just needed someone on the line. While the phone rang, I kept my eyes on him. He never moved. When my brother answered, I whispered what was happening. He told me to stay in the car and that he was calling the police. As soon as I said the word police out loud, the man moved. He turned and walked calmly down the driveway, back onto the sidewalk, and disappeared into the darkness between the houses. I didn't go inside that night. I drove straight to my brother's place and stayed there until morning. The police came later that day and took a report. They searched the area, but found nothing. No one matching the description lived nearby. They told me to call immediately if I saw him again. I hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 2 nights later, he came back. This time, I was already inside. I noticed him because my dog, who almost never barked, started growling at the front door. When I peeked through the curtain, my stomach dropped. He was standing right on my porch. Not knocking, not trying the door, just standing there, facing it. I backed away, quietly, locked myself in the bedroom, and called the police again. I stayed on the line, whispering, as they told me officers were on the way. I watched the front door camera feed on my phone. For nearly 10 minutes, he didn't move. Then, without warning, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead gently against the door. He stayed like that until red and blue lights reflected off the windows. By the time the police arrived, he was gone. That was the last night I stayed in that house. I moved out the next week, breaking the lease and losing my deposit. I didn't care. Months later, I got a call from my old neighbor. She told me that after I left, police arrested a man in the area who had been stalking multiple houses at night, standing outside them for hours, watching. They never proved he broke into any of them, but they found photos, pictures of front doors, windows, and one photo that made my blood run cold. It was my house, taken from across the street, at night, with the lights on inside. This happened when I was 19, during the summer after I graduated high school. My parents went on a 2-week trip overseas, leaving me alone at our house for the first time ever. I was excited about the freedom at first. No curfew, no checking in, just me, the house, and a quiet neighborhood I'd lived in my whole life. The house was a single-story place at the edge of a residential area, backed up against a strip of trees that separated the neighborhood from an old drainage field. I'd walked those trees dozens of times growing up. During the day, they were harmless. At night, they were something else. The first few nights alone were normal. I stayed up late playing games, slept in, ordered food. Nothing felt strange. Until the 5th night. I was in my bedroom around midnight, lying in bed with my phone, when I heard someone say my name. It was faint, almost swallowed by the sound of crickets outside. At first, I thought it came from my phone. I checked my screen. No notifications. No audio playing. Then I heard it again. My name. Clearer this time. It was coming from outside my window. I sat up slowly, my heart starting to race. My bedroom window faced the backyard, just a few yards away from the tree line. The window was closed, but old, thin glass carried sound easily. I held my breath and listened. A few seconds passed. Then, my name. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't whispered either. It was spoken in a calm, almost casual tone, like someone trying to get your attention without startling you. I slid out of bed and walked toward the window, staying low. I peeked through the blinds. The backyard was dark. No movement. The trees stood still, barely visible against the night sky. I told myself it was someone walking nearby. Maybe kids messing around. Maybe someone who knew me from school. Still, I didn't open the window. I stepped back and waited. 10 minutes passed. Just as I started to relax, the voice came again. Closer. My name, followed by, come here. That was when fear really set in. I backed away from the window and locked my bedroom door, even though it felt ridiculous. I grabbed my phone and texted my best friend, asking if he was outside my house. He replied immediately. No. What? I didn't answer. I just sat there listening. For the rest of the night, I didn't hear anything else. The next day, I convinced myself it had been my imagination. I hadn't slept much the night before. My mind could have filled in gaps. That illusion shattered the following night. I was in the living room watching TV when I heard it again, this time coming from the front of the house. My name, spoken clearly. I muted the TV and froze. The voice sounded familiar. Not someone I recognized specifically, but normal. Male. Calm. Almost friendly. I crept toward the front window and peeked through the curtain. The street was empty. Streetlights glowed over parked cars. No one stood on the sidewalk. No one walked past. Then the voice spoke again, right outside the front door. Hey, it's okay. Open up. My hand started shaking. I knew, logically, that no one who belonged there would talk like that. Friends knocked. Neighbors rang the doorbell. They didn't stand in the dark and say your name. I backed away and locked the front door, then checked every window in the house. That night, the voice didn't come back, but I barely slept. On the third night, it got worse. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of tapping. Soft, rhythmic. I lay still listening. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from my bedroom window. Then, quietly, the voice said my name again. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The voice repeated my name, slower this time, like it was making sure I heard. Then it said, I know you're awake. That was enough. I grabbed my phone and called my parents, not caring about the time difference. They didn't answer. The tapping stopped. I stayed frozen in bed until sunrise. In the morning, I checked outside. There were footprints in the dirt near my window. Adult-sized. Too big to be a kid. I called the police. They took a report, but without seeing anyone, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested maybe someone was trying to scare me. That explanation didn't help. The next night, I didn't turn off any lights. I slept on the couch with the TV on, my phone in my hand. Around 2 a.m., the voice returned. This time, it came from multiple places. First the backyard, then the side of the house, then right outside the living room window. Always my name. Always calm. Never angry. Never rushed. Like it had all the time in the world. I called the police again while the voice was still speaking. I whispered into the phone as the operator listened. The moment I said officers were on the way, the voice stopped. Just stopped. When the police arrived, they searched the area and found nothing. That was the last night I stayed alone in that house. I packed a bag the next morning and stayed with my aunt until my parents came back. Before we sold the house years later, a neighbor mentioned something strange. He said there had been reports of a man hiding in the drainage field behind the trees, calling out to people late at night, mimicking voices, trying to lure them outside. They never caught him. Sometimes late at night, I still think about how calmly he spoke. Like he wasn't trying to scare me at all. Like he expected me to come outside. This story happened when I was 24, living in a rural area of Pennsylvania. My friends had convinced me to rent a small cabin for a weekend getaway. It was supposed to be peaceful. No city noise, no crowds, just nature and a few friends for a quiet escape. The cabin itself was modest, tucked near the edge of a dense forest. There was a small clearing around it, maybe 50 feet to the tree line, but beyond that, the woods were thick and dark. The road in was unpaved, and the nearest neighbors were at least half a mile away. Perfect for a weekend of peace, or so I thought. We arrived on a Friday evening, just as the sun was dipping behind the hills. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner on the small outdoor grill, sat around the fire pit, and told stories. The isolation felt good, comforting even. On Saturday morning, we went hiking in the woods behind the cabin. The forest was dense, with winding paths and occasional clearings. I liked the quiet, the way the trees absorb sound. No cars, no voices, just the crunch of leaves under our boots. Later that evening, after returning to the cabin, we made dinner and drank around the fire. Everyone went inside by about 10 o'clock, except me. I stayed out a little longer, enjoying the cool night air and the stars. The moon was half full, barely illuminating the forest. That's when I first noticed it. A figure, just standing, watching. I froze immediately. At first, I thought it was one of my friends playing a prank. But no one stepped forward, no voice called out. The figure remained still, on the edge of the tree line, almost blending with the shadows. I squinted, trying to get a better look. Whoever it was, they weren't moving, not even shifting weight. Just standing, staring. I waved my hand, thinking they'd see me and maybe come closer or leave. Nothing. The figure didn't move. I called out, "Hey, you okay?" No response. By now, my heart was racing. I backed toward the cabin, keeping my eyes on the figure. It didn't budge. My friends were inside. I didn't want to alarm them over nothing. I locked the doors behind me and tried to rationalize. Maybe a hiker got lost. Maybe someone from the nearby town was just wandering. But something about the stillness, the way they didn't react to me calling out, felt wrong. The rest of the night passed without incident. I didn't see the figure again, and I didn't hear anything unusual. The next morning, I told my friends. They laughed, said it was probably a deer or some kind of trick of the moonlight. I wanted to believe them, but a small voice in my head didn't. That afternoon, we went back into the woods for another hike. I tried to shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed friendly in the daylight. Birds chirped, leaves rustled in the wind, and the sunlight filtered through the trees. Nothing like the night before. That evening, though, the figure returned. It wasn't far from the cabin, maybe 20 feet inside the tree line this time. I spotted it as soon as I stepped out onto the porch. I froze. It was taller than I remembered, but still thin. Its features were obscured by shadows. I couldn't tell if it was male or female, young or old, but it was staring straight at me. I backed inside and locked the doors again, heart hammering. My friends were still inside, watching a movie. I debated whether to tell them. If it was just some random person, calling them would be fine. But I didn't want anyone outside tonight. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the edge of the forest. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Just the trees swaying slightly in the wind. I kept watching until the flashlight beam grew dim. I assumed it had left, but I was wrong. Around midnight, I heard a soft sound, the crunch of leaves. Someone was moving through the forest. Slow, methodical, coming closer. I tried calling out again. No response. The noise stopped. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew someone was out there. I woke my friends. 2 of them came outside. 1 stayed inside, nervous. We swept the area with flashlights. Nothing. No footprints, no shadow, no figure. Just a forest. I couldn't shake it. Something was out there just watching. The next day, we left early. None of us slept well. I told myself I'd never come back to that cabin alone, or even with friends. Something about the isolation made people bold, or maybe desperate. Years later, I learned from a local that someone had lived in those woods illegally. They would wander near cabins, sometimes calling names, sometimes just standing and watching. The locals called them the Watcher. No one knew much, and most people left the area if they spotted him. I've never gone back, and every time I hike alone near dense woods, I feel the same way I did that weekend. Like someone is watching me from just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting, patient, silent. Sometimes I wonder if I got lucky, or if I was just naive enough not to know how close I came to finding out the truth. I was looking for a car to buy for my son's 18th birthday. He'd been counting down to that day for years, and I wanted it to be something special, but also something reliable. Not flashy, not new, Just something dependable enough to get him through college and his first job without constant breakdowns. I spent weeks scrolling through every site I could think of. Cars.com, eBay Motors, dealership listings. Everything was overpriced, just like you'd expect. 10-year-old cars with 150,000 miles going for ridiculous prices, sellers acting like they were doing you a favor. Craigslist was the only place that still felt real. About a week into my search, I saw the listing. An '03 Toyota Camry. 67,000 miles. No accidents. Clean title. Good condition. $3,500. It immediately stood out. That kind of mileage on a Camry that old was rare, especially at that price. It almost felt too good to be true, but not so outrageous that I dismissed it outright. Some people just want quick cash. Some people don't know what they have. The photos were simple. No fancy angles. Just a car parked in what looked like a dirt driveway. Beige exterior. Stock rims. Nothing suspicious. No red flags. The seller lived about 10 miles from me. I called the number listed. A man answered after 2 rings. His voice was calm, friendly, completely normal. He introduced himself as Bob. I asked about the car. He assured me there were no issues. Said it had been his late father's car and had barely been driven. He didn't sound rushed or pushy. If anything, he sounded relaxed, almost indifferent. We set a time for me to come see it that afternoon. I brought $3,500 in cash, even though I had every intention of negotiating. Cash always helps. I arrived about 15 minutes early. Bob's house sat at the end of a dirt road, far enough from the nearest neighbors that it felt isolated, but not rural. Just out of the way, a small, old house on a decent-sized property, surrounded by trees that pressed and closed from all sides. The garage door was open. I parked and looked inside, expecting to see the Camry. It wasn't there. The garage was filled with an unusual amount of car parts. Doors, bumpers, hoods, stacked tires, metal scraps, but no actual car. The only vehicle on the property was an old pickup truck parked near the side of the house. I figured maybe Bob had the Camry parked somewhere else. I walked up to the front door to double-check the address. It matched the listing exactly. The doorbell button was missing. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I waited, checking my phone, then knocked again. Over the next 5 minutes, I knocked several times. Loud enough that there was no way someone inside wouldn't hear it. Finally, I decided to call Bob. As soon as the phone started ringing, I heard it. The ringtone, coming from inside the house. I stood there, confused, listening as the ringing echoed faintly through the walls. I stopped the call, waited a second, and tried again. Same thing. The phone was ringing inside. That meant Bob was home, and he knew I was there. I didn't understand why he wouldn't answer the door. At that point, I probably should have just left. But curiosity got the better of me. I'd already driven out there, cash in hand, and nothing had technically gone wrong yet. I walked around the side of the house and looked through one of the front windows. It was dark inside. No lights on. I could barely make anything out at first, just shadows and vague shapes. As my eyes adjusted, I could see what looked like an old-fashioned dining table and chairs. Then I noticed someone standing near the back door. They were completely still, just standing there, facing outside. I assumed it was Bob. I knocked on the glass to get his attention. He didn't move, didn't turn his head, didn't react at all. That's when unease started creeping in. There was no fence or gate around the backyard, so I walked around the house toward the back door. I kept telling myself he was probably messing with me, or hard of hearing, or just distracted. When I reached the back door, I finally saw him clearly. And that's when my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. The figure standing there wasn't alive. It was a taxidermied human being. I don't know how else to describe it. The skin looked real, stretched tight over a stiff frame. The eyes were glassy and lifeless. The posture was unnatural, frozen in place like a grotesque mannequin posed to stare out the door forever. For a split second, I just stood there, unable to breathe. Then survival instinct kicked in. I turned around and ran. I didn't bother being quiet. I didn't bother looking back until I reached my car. My hand was shaking so badly that I fumbled with the keys before finally getting the door open. As I was backing out of the driveway, I looked up at the front window one last time. The blinds were closed now, but 2 of the slats were bent apart just enough for someone to see through. And someone was looking through them. I couldn't see their face clearly, but I could see movement, a presence. Someone standing there, watching me leave. I slammed the gas pedal to the floor and didn't slow down until I was miles away. I drove straight home, heart pounding, replaying everything in my head. None of it made sense. The car parts, the fake listing, the fact that there was no Camry anywhere on the property, the man who answered the phone but refused to come to the door. Whoever Bob was, he was never planning to sell me a car. And the thought that still makes my stomach turn is this. If I hadn't arrived early, if I'd walked inside instead of knocking, if curiosity had pushed me just a little further, there's a very real chance that I would have ended up exactly like that thing standing by his back door. A lifeless statue, frozen in place, staring out at the world that would never come looking for me.